Hi, everyone. Now it's my distinct pleasure to introduce our guest, Professor Putnam. Professor Putnam is the Peter and Isabel Malkin Professor Emeritus of Public Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. In 2006, he received the Sky Prize, the world's highest accolade for a political scientist. And in 2013, President Barack Obama, he awarded him the National Humanities Medal, which is the nation's highest honor for contributions to the humanities. Professor Putnam has also served on the staff of the U.S. National Security Council, and at Harvard, he has served as the Dean of the Kennedy School and the Associate Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. He is the past president of the American Political Science Association, and he has consulted for the last three American presidents and the last three British prime ministers. One of his most recent books, Our Kids, The American Dream in Crisis, was published in March 2015 and was a New York Times bestseller. Now it's my honor to welcome our guest, Professor Putnam, and the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, and thanks you all for showing up. I just want to make one slight correction to that introduction, which is true as far as it goes. I did consult, well, I've consulted with a lot of American presidents, actually going all the way back to Jimmy Carter, but you said the last three American presidents. I did not consult for the last US president. That is, the only recent president that I've not consulted for is a guy named Trump, who was literally the last American president. So I don't want to fly under false colors here. I am not a close advisor to former President Trump, even though I've been an advisor to the Bushes and the Obamas and the Clintons and as you said, to several British and presidents and prime ministers around the world, including Singapore, for example, and Finland. Okay, enough of that. I want to talk to you, I want to show you some pictures, that is graphs and charts, from the study that you mentioned, Zunin, in introducing me, which is a book called Our Kids. I've written a lot of different books, but I wanted to talk about this book with you because in one sense, you are all starring actors in the play that I'm about to describe to you, as are my own grandchildren, who are just about your age. They're a little older than you. So let's step back, and I want to say what's been happening. If we have the next slide, can you call the slides up, Zunin?
Oh, sorry, am I muted? My bad. Yeah, let me screen share actually.
Good.
Can everyone see this?
Can everyone see that? As a way, actually, you're showing two different slides on the screen. For now, that's okay, but it'll get a little complicated if you. That's two slides actually. Let's see. Do you see what I mean? That's, yeah. That's
I can zoom in.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's go. It'll get confusing a little later down if we don't. Let's see what we're going to see now.
Google Slides should work.
Yeah. Okay. Now.
Yep, there we go.
Full screen. Let's see. Yeah. Perfect. Okay. So this is just the introduction, and I'm conscious that I'm keeping all of you from doing something much more interesting at the beach or wherever else you are in southern Italy. So I'm going to try to be quick, and I'm going to count on you you're all smart, I know you are, and you're going to be able to pick up the basic idea of the charts. Let's have the next slide. I'll begin there. This is a big picture. I'm beginning at 30,000 feet, and then I'm going to be zooming down, eventually zooming down to you, individuals in this, that you're listening to me. But big picture, since the 1970s, America has become much more divided along class lines. First of all, I don't know if that you hear the rain in the background here, but I'm in the middle of I'm up in New Hampshire, and I'm in the middle of a summer shower, so all of my grandchildren are rushing up from the pond. What's happened in the last half century is that America has become much more divided along social class lines. By social class, I mean income and education and so on, socioeconomic status. First of all, the income distribution has become much more skewed over the last 50 years. Many more people in the lower 2/3 of the income distribution, and many fewer people, but way up in the upper income distribution. And so the gap between rich and poor has become much more skewed in the last 50 years. You've heard about that in the last probably 5 years or 10 years, but the fact is it's been going on for 50 years. I don't mean to make judgments about your own personal background, but in general, Weston is one of the richest school districts in America. So I'm guessing that on average, most of you are from relatively affluent backgrounds. And therefore, I don't mean that your parents are gazillionaires, but I mean, compared to everybody else in America, your families, and for that matter, my family, are doing pretty well. It's not only, though, that the income distribution has become more, class segregation has increased. That is, increasingly, rich folks are living on one side of town, say Weston, and poor folks are living on another side of town, even pretty close, the town just across the turnpike from you is a much poorer town. It's not poor. You'd have to go into the center part of Boston to find poor people, but still, Waltham is pretty modest in its economic terms. So when I say there's increasing segregation, I mean increasingly people are living on one side of the town, the rich folks are, and the other side of town, the poor folks are. That did not used to be true. It's also true in class. That is, increasingly rich kids are only, I'm using rich kids as simply as a summary for kids up in the upper part of the income distribution, whose parents come from the upper part of this income distribution. Rich kids are increasingly concentrated in schools where they only go to school with other rich kids, and that's also true at the bottom of the income hierarchy. Poor kids are increasingly concentrated in schools where they only see and only play sports and only ever encounter poor kids. That didn't used to be true. And there's increasing class segregation in marriage. Increasingly, rich kids are only marrying other rich kids. It didn't used to be true. It used to be that sometimes kids from relatively affluent, well-educated backgrounds would marry kids from a little lower in the hierarchy. That's very rare now. And that means the whole of American society is becoming much more divided in social class lines. I'm talking about social class here. I'm not talking about race. Race is a somewhat different story, and we can come to that if you want to. But what I am talking about is simply class. Social class segregation has increased in all these ways. And finally, another big change is that family and social bonds within the working class have deteriorated and haven't deteriorated within the upper middle class. So I mean, even things like playing extracurricular activities is increasingly, not just your kids, if they're in extracurricular activities, increasingly playing only with kids from their same class background. In the rich schools and rich parts of town, kids are increasingly playing extracurricular activities. But at the same time, kids on the poor side of town are decreasingly playing extracurricular activities. Let me pause just for a minute and just nod your heads if what I'm saying, I don't mean you're convinced yet, but you understand the basic story that I'm telling. America is increasingly really divided in social class terms, and not the last 5 or 10 years since you've been alert. I mean, since you've been conscious, I'm assuming, or even the last 20 years since before you were born, that's been going on, but it's been going on since before your parents were born. That's the astonishing thing. This is a long trend. It's not just about, let's say, the Trump years or the last decade. It's a 50-year deep and growing trend. Now, what follows from that is I'm going to show you a series of what I call scissors graphs. And I'll show you in just a minute what I mean by scissors graphs. That is, the upper line in these graphs is going to be representing trends among kids coming from the upper part, from upper income or upper educational backgrounds. And the lower line is what's been happening to kids coming from relatively less affluent backgrounds. And those scissors graphs are going to turn out to be, first of all, very pervasive, and secondly, very bad for American society. That's the big story that I'm going to be telling here. So let's go to the next graph. And I'm going to go through the graphs quickly because you'll understand them as soon as I describe them, and I don't want to take too much time just doing numbers for you. I'm trying to convey that there are a lot of numbers. This is not just Bob Putnam's, I didn't just wake up this morning and figure this is the way the world is. I'm a numbers social scientist. So let's go to the next slide if we can. Okay. Here, this is one aspect of that. And you see the scissors graphs there. In all the graphs, the lower axis is going to be time, and the vertical axis is going to be some aspect of kids, of the life of kids. As you can see here, this graph shows one particular trend among dozens. I'm not going to show you all of them, but this is one important one. Are kids living in a single parent family with only one parent, almost always the mom? Are they living with a single mom, or are they living with two parents? Two parents turns out to be a big advantage for many reasons, but this is the trend. As you can see, since the 1950s, there was a little bit of an increase in the now around 1990s, a tiny increase in the number of kids coming from relatively affluent backgrounds. That's the lower line here. Their parents have a BA or more. That's a third of the American population have a BA or more. And as you can see, but that's dropped back down. And so those relatively affluent families are now kind of just like old-fashioned families. That is mom, dad, and the kids. But at the same time, there's been a huge increase in single-parent families among kids with whose parents have a high school degree or less. And in this case, that's the lower third of American society. So these two graphs, in this case, I'm comparing the upper third and lower third of American society. And what you can see, I hope, is that now, or at least as late as 2012, it's actually continued. So now the number of kids who are living in a single parent family who are coming from that lower third of the population is something like 80%, 75 or 80%. It's just huge. And it's 10 times the number. It's the number down in the bottom, if you carry the graph forward to today, is down about 7%. So an enormous difference. It didn't used to be a big gap between rich and poor. There always was some gap between rich kids and poor kids, but now it's enormous. I want to pause here because all the graphs I'm going to show you have some of this shape. And does this make sense? Zubian and Guillaume and I'm sorry, I can't see everybody's name here, but shake your head if this makes sense. And if you should be honestly shocked by this trend, because what it says is American kids are growing up increasingly in a class-defined context. And this is just one aspect of that. Let's have the next slide. Here it is. Parents can invest in their kids in two ways, and I'm simplifying this a lot. Parents can invest time in their kids being raised, and money in their kids being raised. And here we're looking at trends over this same period, but the same division. Upper level is how much the parents, college-educated parents, how much time they devote to their kids. It's what we call a good night moon time. Actually, raise your hand if you've even heard of Good Night Moon. It's a very famous children's, okay, Maxwell has heard of it, but some of the others you haven't. It's a very, very famous kids book. I read it to my children and they read it in terms of their grandchildren. So we just call this Good Night Moon time. And what you see is it didn't used to be, parents spent time reading to their kids. Working class and middle class kids both got about the same amount of quality time with their parents. Do you see that? That's over around the 1970s. And now it's huge difference. Remember, that's per day. So that's the difference. Well, it's increased. So it's now about 1 hour per day more that kids on average from college educated homes get to spend with their parents. Another example is going to be, that I'm going to show you briefly later, is Do you have dinner with your parents? Do you have a family? Do you all eat together as a family? And up in the upper part of the society, increasingly numbers of kids are having dinner with their parents, and down at the bottom, increasingly poor kids are not having, they're not having almost any contact at all with their parents. So this is another aspect of the difference. It's how they invest in time and how they invest time in their kids. And they also invest money, of course. And here we're looking at what's called enrichment expenses. That is not just how much do they pay for their kids' food, but how much do they pay for their, trips to Italy, or their, or computers, or, all those kinds of enriched summer camp. How much do they pay for that? That's what this is looking at. And you can see, I think you can see that the top decile, and now we're getting a little closer to where you guys are, the top decile has gone from about per year, $3,000 a year for all those summer camps and trips to the, trips to Italy and so on, gone to $7,000. So a huge increase. Rich kids have always had somewhat more money being spent on them than poor kids. Even back in the 70s, rich kids had, a little more income being spent on. But this is another one of those scissors graphs, so that you can see, actually, if you look really carefully, you'll see down in the bottom decile, kids are actually, in absolute terms, getting less money they have fewer summer camps. So think of this as the summer camp gap, or the, the laptop gap, or the trips to Italy gap. That's what this is saying. Increasingly, another one of these scissors graphs. You all see what I'm trying to describe here? And I hope you can realize, at least one of you, is that I've forgotten who's actually in. Zumin, you're in Naples right now?
Yes.
Okay, so you embody, I'm sure you're a wonderful kid. I'm not doubting that in a second. My grandchildren also spent time in Italy. So I'm not casting aspersions on you. I'm just saying, can you now begin to see how the resources available to you, in this case, financial resources, presumably from your parents. I don't mean to be too personal, Zunian, because I'm not trying to single you out, and I have no idea what your parents do or how much educated they are, but you're a terrific example of exactly what we're talking about here. Whereas meanwhile, someplace in Waltham, there's not some kid who's hardly ever been out of Boston, much less to Italy. I'm trying to convey in ordinary language what's going on here. We have the next slide. These are, I'll be quicker here. The one on the left shows trends in family dinners. That's what I said before. Do you sit down and have dinner with your family? Well, that's been going down for everybody for a while, but then beginning about 1990, that trend of fewer family dinners stopped among college-educated families and continued to plunge among working class families, high school educated families. And the same thing is true for extracurricular activities. I mentioned that earlier, that there was not only a gap between rich kids and poor kids in terms of their, they're increasingly in segregated schools, but actually a huge difference in whether they can even, play soccer or not. And it probably seems to you like, well, who doesn't play soccer? And I'm sure that actually almost every kid in Weston plays soccer. Raise your hands if that's true, or is it true that almost all of your friends play soccer? Yes, no.
Kind of.
Okay. But if you,
I think we all used to play soccer.
Okay, great, thank you. That's and now you're spending time in Italy or whatever. Got it. Let's have the next slide, because I'm conscious that the time is going fast and I want to be able to leave time for questions. Same thing is true for church attendance. Another one of these scissors graphs. Church attendance is down a little bit in the upper class and lower class, but it's down a lot more. And that's important because I'm not worried about whether kids, are getting on along with God. That's not my point. It's that churches provide adult care. They provide, people who are looking out for you outside your family. And that's down a lot. And on the right side, in a way, the most dangerous part of this whole, or at least the most significant part of all the graphs I'm showing you, do you trust other people? Increasingly, well, as you'll not be surprised to know that trust, social trust, trust in other people is down for both, on both upper and lower class kids, but it's down much more among lower class kids. Trust is down. Now, what that means is, and let's go to the next slide because I think this summarizes it. The fundamental feature, this is in a way where all of this has been headed so far. Rich kids have lots of people in their lives who they trust and whom they can trust and provide support to them. Their parents, their school teachers, they're in good schools, so they have good school teachers. They're, you know, if they're religious, they've got people at church they can count on to pay attention to them. They've got coaches that they can pay attention to. They're not isolated. But poor kids are increasingly isolated. This is the most important difference between in the lives of rich kids and poor kids. Poor kids are increasingly isolated from everybody, and they can't trust anybody. They can't trust their parents. They can't trust their neighbors because they're living in increasingly living in dangerous neighborhoods. They can't trust anybody. And among other things, they lack savvy. That is, they don't have the same kind of general, I think you probably know what I mean by savvy. For example, they have no idea how you go about filling out a college application form. They don't have anybody in their lives who's done that or is there to help them do that. And they lack what I call airbags. Kids everywhere, rich kids and poor kids, get into trouble. They get into an accident, they back the car into the next door neighbor's, you know, mailbox or whatever. My grandchildren get in trouble. I got in trouble. But if you're coming from an affluent family, what you know is that airbags inflate when you get in. And what I mean by an airbag is somebody comes and helps you out. And poor kids, they don't have those airbags, and therefore, if they, you know, get in an accident or get caught up in drugs or whatever, no airbag. And so their lives are fundamentally different, and much more different now than they were, you know, 50 years ago when I was growing up. Let's have the next slide. One consequence of that, I'm actually going to skip this graph. It also applies to daycare. Again, it's boring. You see all these scissors graphs, they all tell the same thing. I think I want to go to the next slide if I'm right. Yeah, as it turns out now, and I'm going to pause over this graph just a minute because it's really important for you to see this. Now, family income, your family's income matters more than how good you are in getting to college. If you look at the right-hand side of this graph, those three bars at the right-hand side, we're looking at all kids from upper class homes. And you'll see that high test score kids and on the sort of light gray figure on the right-hand side, which says 30%, that means that 30% of kids who are low, they come from homes, that come from affluent homes, but they're, you know, not the sharpest kid on the block. And of them, 30% nevertheless go to college. And of people who've got it all going for them, they're high ability, they have high test scores, and they're also affluent. 74% of them end up graduating from college. So far, so good. You see how to read that? That's the right-hand side of the graph. And on the left-hand side of the graph, of people who are both low in ability and also low in family resources, only 3% graduate from college. You might be shocked at the difference between the 3% who are the less able. These are still decent kids, but they're less able and they come from poor homes, 3%, as opposed to, I'm sure it's even higher than 73% for you guys and your peers in Weston are going to be going to college and graduating from college. So, but there are test score differences among the lower class people. That's the difference between 3% who are low test scores. Merit makes a difference among poor kids. 29% of them who are smart but poor. But here's what I want you to look at. Compare the two middle bars. The dark one of the left the dark one on the among low-income people, which is 29%, and the light gray one among people who are among higher SES. Look at those numbers and now unpack them. Think what that means. Rich, dumb kids are more likely to graduate from, I'm sorry, I don't mean dumb. I mean rich kids who are relatively untalented are more likely to graduate from college than poor kids who are very talented. Any American should be shocked at that graph. Because that says, and it wasn't always this way. That's all those V graphs that I showed you, the scissors graphs that I showed you, showed this is not something that's been true forever and ever. It didn't used to be that way. Indeed, 50 years ago, mostly it was merit that mattered, but now it isn't anymore. We're not a meritocracy at all. It's your parents' income that matters more than how good you are. And that's fundamentally violates, I think, the fundamental norms of America, that everybody ought to be able to get as far as their ability takes them. You not if you sort of, you don't mean not agree with me, but not if what I'm saying to you makes sense. You're sort of following the argument. Let's go to the last graph. I mean, the last chart. I think the next one is the last. Okay. So the fundamental, there are a lot of causes. If we had more time, I'd go through 66 different causes for these trends. But it's the fundamental one is we have a shriveled sense of we. When I was growing up in the 1960s, a long time ago, and my parents said, we've got to do something for our kids, they did not mean my sister and me. They thought of all the kids in town as being their kids. And so when they said we got to get a swimming pool for our kids, they did not mean a swimming pool in our own backyard. They meant we ought to all pay more taxes so that every kid in town could have a swimming pool at the high school. That's what our kids meant. And that's why the book from which these data are drawn was called Our Kids. But what has happened since then is that the notion of we has shriveled. And so if you talk to people in my hometown right now about our kids, the words our kids has changed its meaning. It no longer means all the kids in town. It means our own kids, the kids that I gave birth to. And that fundamental cultural thing is that America has become, over these 50 years, more of less of a we society and more of an I society. You understand what I mean when I say an I society and a we society? And that's the big picture. The biggest picture is America over the last 50 years has become an I society, not a we society. And that's bad for America. Poor kids are not just somebody else's kids, they're our kids too. We should think about that. That's our well-being. My well-being turns on not just how well my own children and grandchildren do, but on how well other people's kids do, because it turns out that the economy will grow better if those kids too get a fair shake. Okay, so I am just about done. I'm about to...
Sorry, just accidentally clicked the escape key, sorry.
That's not a problem because I'm just about done. Shared investment in everybody's kids was key to American growth and fairness in the past. And it's key to restoring the American dream today. Indeed, this problem that I'm talking to you about now, I think is close to the most fundamental problem facing America today, that poor kids no longer have a fair shot at what we would call equal opportunity. That's what all these charts and graphs show. And so it's not surprising that those kids couldn't give a damn about polarization or whether we're having fights on Capitol Hill or all that. This switch from an I society, from a we society to an I society, is fundamental to political polarization, fundamental to slow growth. And now I want to come back to the very end, as I sort of promised or threatened you that I would. This issue narrowing the I-we gap, narrowing these scissors graphs over the next 15, 20 years. It'll take that long. That's an especially important moral obligation for my own grandchildren. They benefited from this because they come, you know, I and my wife we're not rich, but we've got a decent income. I'm calling you from our second home up in New Hampshire. We've got a very nice home right on the looking over the Charles in Cambridge. We both have graduate degrees. Our kids all have graduate degrees. Our grandchildren all graduated from one of the best colleges or universities in America, from Harvard or from Princeton or from Harvard or Swarthmore or whatever. What I'm trying to say is, I am not just talking about you. I'm talking about my own grandchildren. They have a moral obligation to worry about other people's kids, to worry about the kids on the downside of all of these scissors graphs. And that's true of my own grandchildren. And I think, honestly, that it's also true of you. At least that's what I'd like to, that's the message I would like to preach today. I'm a little bit of a preacher. You probably can tell that. I'm done. I know I went over time. I apologize for that. But I can stay for a little bit now if you have questions you want to raise with me, and we can get rid of the slides so we can just talk face to face.
So does anyone have any questions? Siang, Maxwell, in the meantime? Yes, Max.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right. So I know that I believe you said it was 66 total causes for the general data in the graphs.
You didn't take me seriously that there are 66 and not 60.
No, but like
there are many causes.
Many causes. But like, which one would you say out of those many causes would be the most influential or the most had the biggest impact on the data?
Well, probably the growth in economic inequality, which is a big deal. But you can't separate those from other possible causes. It's intertwined. It's not just a single this caused that. It's this caused that and that caused this and so on.
Yeah.
Let me be a little more specific than that. A big part of it is this growth in economic inequality, but part of that is due to the change in politics.
Yeah.
It's to some extent, the change in politics is upstream of the economic inequality. It's because when Donald Trump cut taxes on rich folks, he was exacerbating that. Or anybody who's, I don't mean to blame this just on, I want to repeat, it's not just about Trump, because it's been going on for 50 years. But when anybody has cut taxes on rich folks, Republican or Democrat, that's being upstream of the economics. And to some extent, the economics is upstream of the politics, because the economics allows some people, rich people, to, through campaign contributions, change the policies of the politicians. So I'm trying to simplify what is really complex, but there's feedback loops between the economics and the politics. And there's but when I said that I thought the I-we difference, that is this shift from a focus on we, that we're all in this together, to a focus on I'm just out for myself. I think that's really upstream of all of them. Is this making, you see what I'm trying to say?
Yeah.
I'm not suggesting you should do any more reading of Putnam, but my most recent book, which is the title of The Upswing, looks in great detail at the question of what's the big picture that's going on, not just for kids, but what's the big picture that's going on here? And that shows very clearly, quite startlingly, that the main driver is not the politics. The main driver is not the economics. Economics is, if anything, a lagging indicator. It's coming along. And the leading indicator is culture or moral. That is to say, the leading indicators, the thing that has to change first. This is what I want to say. And I mean to be speaking, Max, to you personally, actually, as well as the others here. If we're going to turn this around, it's going to require people just like you to begin looking at the world in a morally different way. It's not some strange morals, right? It means treating other people like you want to be treated yourself. It's a golden rule. This is not some bizarre economics morals I'm talking about. But until that happens, and the last time we were in a situation much like this 125 years ago, and then it was young people. It was young people just like you who led the country, driven by a sense of moral fervor that they didn't cause it. You didn't cause any of these problems. You personally had nothing to do. These began, that's the point of my story here. You were not even, your parents were barely alive, much less you when this all began. And so it's not like you caused any of this, but it is the case, only someone like you can fix it. And if you believe the argument in this other book called The Upswing, you are the only people who can do it, and you can do it only by beginning to think and act with a different kind, not a bizarre morality. It's just a basic, do unto others. Is that making sense, Max?
Yeah. Thank you.
A long answer to a really tough question.
Thank you so much. Xiang, do you have a question by any chance?
Yeah, I do. It's gonna be kind of long, but a little about myself. So I really resonated with all the things that you did say, because personally, as for myself, I wasn't always in the situation that I used to. A lot of my old friends, they've gone through exactly the things that you've talked about. And I feel like one of the biggest challenges in breaking this social capital, this social barrier, is that they're too afraid to do it. There's too many factors that hinder them. And so personally, from the perspective of somebody who is or was living in low income situations, what is the biggest thing that you would say to those individuals in order for them to escape that sort of social and economic inequality?
So that is a big and tough question, Xiang. It's a great, super question. I'm really glad you posed it the way you did. It's a great question, but it's a tough question. The first thing I would say is that there are two different versions of that question. What can they do to fix the larger societal problem? And the second thing is, what can they do to fix their own version of that larger problem? You see the distinction I'm making. And neither of those is an easy question. Let's focus first on what they can do. How can they get out of this fix that they, through no fault of their own, are in? And the first thing to say is, it is absolutely no fault of their own, but they can have agency. Agency is a highfalutin term, meaning there are things that they can do. And this is true for all of you. It's true for, I don't know, Max, I don't have any idea exactly what your background is, but the other thing I'm sorry, forgive me for a minute, Xiang, because I want to go back to the question that Max asked. And this goes back to the book called The Upswing. One thing you learn from that story is history is not inevitable. The last time we went through this in around 1900, most people thought that we were going to hell in a handbasket and there was no way out of it. But there were some young people, mostly young people, who said, no, we didn't cause this, but we're going to have to fix it. And they had agency. That's what I'm trying to convey. And Xiang, this is a little bit relevant to your case, or you're asking me to advise the people who you've left behind in a way. Agency, so I'm going to finish saying that to Max. Max, do you see what I mean when I say agency you didn't cause this, but that doesn't mean you can't fix it. Doesn't mean it will fix itself. It's not going to fix itself. It'll only fix itself if you and other people like you take action. Okay, that's relevant. It's especially relevant to the social side of the question that Xiang has asked. There are opportunities out there, and particularly in, I'm thinking actually the Boston area. Was it in the Boston area that you,
No, it was I think in New York, like yeah, New York area, but it's like
okay.
Not the central area.
Okay, yeah. Well, one crucial thing is to find mentors. By that I mean adults, maybe outside the family. If there are stable adults in the family, if the family itself, the family unit is stable, that's great. And I don't want to make this sound in any sense, it's not meant, and I don't think it will sound as alluding to particular national backgrounds, but in fact, one reason that Asians are less likely to be caught in this is that in general, the Asian family is stronger. So the most important kind of social capital, that is closest in connections, are less damaged in working class Asian families. I know very well there are many, many different kinds of Asian families. There's Japanese are not the same as Chinese, as the same as, you know, as Indo-Chinese, or I mean, Vietnamese or whatever. I know that, and so you know it obviously, but in general, Asian families are stronger, and that means many Asian kids, even though they're in this trap and they're caught in a bad neighborhood and they're not necessarily going to good schools, with the support of their parents, they're more likely to make it out than, for example, Black Americans, who tend to have much more damaged families, or for that matter, poor white Americans. Poor white Americans, this is not mostly about race. Poor white Americans, also working class white Americans, they're not concentrated in New York. They're concentrated in, in places like, Schenectady, New York, or Youngstown, Ohio, and that's where a lot of the support for Trump is coming from, the poor white kids from poor white families. So it sounds like I'm escaping the question. I'm not. I'm trying to say, if you happen to benefit from a strong family, rely on them. They're likely to, they may not even speak English, but they're very likely to be providing you with strong guidance and social support. That's the first thing. But secondly, if you don't have that in your own family, and most poor kids don't, then go looking for mentors. Do you know what I mean? See, when I say mentors, I mean people who are going to look out for you and advise you and guide you. And that's, sometimes there are formal mentor programs. That is Big Brother, Big Sister, for example, as an example of you know what I mean by Big Brother, Big Sister? You've heard of that organization? It's an organization that, a volunteer organization in which relatively well-off adults, young men, in the case of poor boys, or young women in the case, middle-aged women in the case of poor girls.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Those are formal mentorships, and that can be very important. But there are all sorts of, in the life of rich kids, there are many, many, many informal mentors. Let me see what I mean by that. I mean by that coaches, for example, right? So let's go back to the fact that rich kids have lots of extracurricular activities and poor kids don't. It's not, what's happening is not that those rich kids are going to be likely to enter professional baseball or professional soccer. It's that the coaches in those extracurricular activities are likely to be providing support to them. They're informal mentors. Is making sense so far? And there are now organizations. There's one there's one in Boston that I know very well because a former student of mine later became a leader of it. And it's an organization that is based around tennis. And so what it involves is taking kids from East Boston, let's say, which is an area of very, very poor, lots of poor immigrant kids, and offering them an opportunity to learn to play tennis. Again, not because they're going to become international professional champions of tennis, but because that enables, that's the context in which they can get informal mentoring. And so what's been shown actually is if you join that tennis organization, I've forgotten for the moment the name of the organization, but it's gone national now, but it was based actually initially in East Boston. Did I say South Boston? I didn't mean South Boston, I meant East Boston. It's based in East Boston, and it is demonstrably helping kids in East Boston, many of whom are immigrants, some of whom are not immigrants. First of all, learn to play tennis. It sounds like but that's not the big deal. The big deal is providing them with connections outside to the wider world, helping them learn to fill out a college application form. These are all, for somebody in the Weston schools, it's trivial to fill out. I mean, they probably do it for you and fill out the application form, but you certainly know a gazillion people who've done it and know how to do it. If you're living in East Boston, that's not true. And that's what these mentors, these tennis mentors do. Is that making sense, Siang? I'm trying to...
Yeah, so how I'm seeing it is like you're talking about like all these like social groups, like the most important thing that everyone is getting out of it is information, right? So the information to succeed, the information to climb up, all of that thing.
It is in part information, but it's not, yes, but it's important not to have a too purely cognitive or intellectual interpretation of what they're getting. They're also getting love and support. They're also getting encouragement that many poor kids just don't have because they don't have anybody close to them. So when they trip and fall, there's nobody there to help them pick them up and say, okay, you can do this, get up. It's a part, of course, Siang, it's information. But I think if you say information, people are too likely to think, oh, that's just about, well, we could do that, fix that by just telling them to log onto the internet. It's not about it's not about mostly about information. It's mostly about social and emotional support, which is for kids who do well, like my grandchildren, they've got a ton of social support. I love them. My wife loves them. Their parents love them. Their coaches love them. Their teachers love them. Everybody loves them. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but that's basically true. But their counterparts, and some of my grandchildren actually are immigrant. I mean, they're Latino because their father is Costa Rican. But even they have, so they have a little bit of the quote disadvantage that comes from being an immigrant. But the main thing is they've got a loving father and a loving mother and loving coaches and all the things that I've just talked about. It sounds like I'm back being a moralizer and talking about love, but actually that's more important than the purely informational thing that says, here's how you fill out the form. Is this making sense? Siang, you may not agree with me, but I want to make sure I'm...
Oh yeah, I understand, yep.
Okay.
Thank you so very much, Professor Putnam. So one of our members, he wanted to send in a couple of questions, even though he cannot make it. So one of the questions is actually related to the topic of agency and how kind of our generation, even though we didn't create these problems, we have to fix it. And one of them that's especially large is climate change.
Yes.
And so kind of like related to the topic of like social issues, when tackling international problems like climate change, global food shortages, and even terrorism, what are some of the things that the world is doing well, if any? And what should we focus on, like given the wide expanse of topics?
Sure. Let me begin and try to answer that question in a narrow way, and then I'll try to get a little broader. Currently, I think the most important reason for optimism about global warming is Greta Thunberg. Now, why do I say that? Greta Thunberg is really young. She represents what it will look like if we're now at the front edge of turning this big I thing around. That is, if we're going to get another upswing, I told you before, it's going to come from young people with agency who not only agency, but they have a different set of values, right? The values that encompass all of us, we, the biggest we there is, that is humans on Earth. And so I don't mean that Greta Thunberg is a saint. I don't have no idea whether she's a saint. I don't mean, of course, I do not mean that she alone is going to fix this problem. I mean, she exemplifies what it will look like if we're going to turn this thing around. It will come from young people like her who have a new mindset, a new morality, and who are very much focused on we. Because the global warming is the quintessential problem that you can't fix alone. It's exactly a we problem. And as long as you're looking at the world through I lenses, I'm only, for me, I'm worried about whether what my gas is my petrol is going to cost, or I'm worried about, whether I can have don't have to, all the things that the opponents of action on global warming are saying. I'm going to lose my job, blah, blah, blah. You're focused on the I. But if everybody in the country, everybody in the world focuses only on I, we'll never fix it. It's a quintessential we problem. It has to be done all together. If one person does it, it can't fix the problem. It's like you have one hand clapping. It's not clapping if only one hand's clapping. And this is just like that. So I guess what I'm doing is agreeing with the anonymous person who asked this question about global warming. I think global warming, I'll be very clear. We are not going to solve global warming until we can solve the I-we-I problem, the I-we problem. That's the short version of what I'm saying. And back in the day, I mean, a couple of minutes ago, Max asked me, what do you think is the fundamental cause and how are we going to fix this? That you asked some version of that question. And I said it was the I-we, seeing the world in we terms rather than I words. And that is especially true of global warming. I assure you, we're not going to solve the problem. And the only hope is that some young people around the world, like Greta Thunberg, are actually, and many people of your generation actually, are thinking in those we terms. And that's terrific. It's wonderful. Because if that doesn't happen, we're never going to fix the global warming problem. Can simply not be solved if you're in a I mindset. Now, that's true for a lot of other problems. It's not quite so dramatically true for other global issues like international disease, but is that true there too? I mean, for goodness sake, I sort of have this feeling every morning I wake up and there's another headline in the world, another headline in the newspaper about some problem we're not going to solve if we look at it from an I point of view. The COVID is another classic example of that. I can do whatever I want to do to save myself up here in New Hampshire. There's nobody around here except the moose and the bears, so I'm not going to get it up here. But unless people like me and people more generally in America wear masks and stop and do lots of what look like altruistic things, sending vaccines and aid to people in poor countries, the virus is going to go over there, hide out, change, and come back and hit us. It's a classic. What's the technical term here is dilemma of collective action. If you want to ever begin to study this seriously, you need to learn a little bit about game theory. This is not a guilt trip I'm laying on you, but the underlying everything I've said today, there is actually a quite serious mathematical analysis that's called game theory. And one of the ideas out of game theory is called a dilemma of collective action. And I'm not going to take time now. You could all understand it if I spent half an hour explaining it, but I'm not going to take time now for that. But if you want to do more offline, just write down dilemma of collective action. That's the key to all of these things I'm talking about. The world is faced with lots of dilemmas of collective action. And unless we resolve that those dilemmas of collective action by being more attuned to the we and less attuned to the I, we're in big trouble on any big problem you can name. We're going to be in more trouble. I'll give you one factoid. As somebody indicated here, I use the term social capital to refer to the sense in which we connect with other people. And you can measure social capital, an individual social capital and a community social capital. And then, we now have lots and lots of data about who in the world and in what countries or what counties or what cities or what, census districts have suffered more or less from COVID. And the best predictor of greater deaths is less social capital. I mean, that's statistically true. That's been found by a half dozen researchers around the world. Counties in America or cities in America that have low social capital, that is, less likely to worry about the we and more likely to worry about the I, have demonstrably higher death rates, controlling for everything else you can imagine. That is, controlling from the age structure and, all those other things. It's partly because they wear masks. It's partly because they do other things that help other people. Am I speaking too elliptically here, or do you understand? Because what I'm saying is actually ought to be shocking, that it's nothing medical. It's the way we treat other people and the way our neighbors treat other people that is going to affect how many of us die. There have been calculations as to how many, if everybody in America had high social capital, by which I mean the way we did 50 years ago when we had a lot of it, the number of Americans who would have died in this epidemic is hundreds of thousands fewer. It's astonishing. So if you want to phrase it this way, and you can quote me on this, hundreds of thousands of Americans have died because we're too focused on I and not enough on we. Another way to say that is if this same virus had hit America in the 1960s when we were at a higher point of social capital, it would have been not nearly such a bad deal. Not because the virus was any different, but because we were different. Is that making sense? Yeah. I hope it's making sense.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, go ahead. I know you've all got to go.
Yeah, just to be mindful of time, we're already quite a few minutes late. So this was a wonderful discussion, and thank you so very much for joining us, Professor Putnam, and thank you everyone for coming. And see you guys later.
I will say one last thing as we go. Max and Zunian and Siang, I am counting on you. I will be looking back 20 or 30 years from now and saying, did you guys do take your part in this task? I'm just trying to lay a little guilt trip on you, but this is not academic stuff that I'm talking about. It affects not so much me actually, but it affects your future. And I'm counting on you to do the right thing. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.